or social organizations, or through leadership, you can arrest them or preempt them or whatever, and that's not the way it happened. Now I submit to you that this is it's an indication not just of a political trend, it's an indication of a psychological mood of empowerment that is pervasive across the region, and that's only growing, and it's likely to grow in the region because that information revolution is only going to expand, because no one can put it back in a bottle because it's now tied to economic prosperity. No one can govern without it expanding. And for that reason, my own assumption is the public empowerment that we now see is here to stay. Whether it's in Egypt or anywhere else in the Arab world, it's here to stay. It's only going to increase over time. And whatever happens, one cannot predict revolutions. We don't know where it's going to go from here in other Arab countries, or whether or not Arab countries may not learn to deal with it, and they have in the past, and they could figure out a way to live with it. But that's not the point. They may. Our governments may actually survive and figure out a way to deal with it. But the equation changes dramatically. Because now, for whatever decision you have to make, whether it's domestic and international, you have to take public sentiment into account in that form. And easy for our rulers, when you get pressure from a superpower and you get pressure from the public in autocratic days, is that it's much easier to resist your public pressure than to resist the superpower pressure. And that does bear on American foreign policy. I mean, at some point we have to, for the U.S., it's going to impact the way the U.S. sees, the processes in the region and calculates its own interests. So I think that part is now part of the equation, no matter what happens in the future. And that's why I happen to say what I said earlier, which is that these events are so far exactly bin Laden's nightmare. But the other side is why do I think that if this experiment is not allowed to succeed, that is the public responsiveness to the public to a large extent, demand for participation, why it would turn into a nightmare for the international community as well as the local countries. And that is because I think the empowerment will stay there. Nobody's going to take it away from you. The taste of freedom, the taste of, the individual power is there, it's not going to go back. So what is going to change is that it's going to be channeled into other methods. I happen to believe, as I said earlier, that the fact that this revolution and the Tunisian revolutions were peaceful are accidental facts. I think it's an accident of history. We need to think about it a little bit more, not to be taken for granted. Revolutions often are violent revolutions, and these were not. And that is not there's nothing here that suggests that variable is a constant variable in the historic change that we're seeing. And that is why I worry that if these experiments are not allowed to succeed, we can launch a completely different experiment of people who will demand that their voice is heard, but they will use other means. I'm optimistic that it will not go that way. And I'm optimistic that there is already some thinking, people understanding the change outside. What I hope from Washington's point of view, from my own country's point of view, is that we don't see these events as just a short-term crisis to deal with and then go to business as usual, because what I see in these profound historic changes is something that the US and other countries are going to have to deal with in the long term. And we can no longer define our policies in a way that is at its core against the aspirations of the public in the region, because you're going to run into one crisis after another in the coming years, and we're going to have to rethink. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shibley, and thanks also for the somber reminder before we continue celebration here for the peaceful revolution, to be reminded of the historical fact that something might come if we cannot meet the expectation of people as everybody wanted. And you are right also that there is a problem, at least linguistic, whether to consider that President Mubarak stepped down or asked him to be stepped to a force. And we always come with coining words in Arabic for things like that. During Mubarak's regime, we used to have a problem whenever someone commits suicide, or they announced to us that he committed suicide after he became a political liability for the regime. We always say, intaharu. They made him commit suicide. So this maybe they made him step down, might be something that we find in Arabic. I would like to invite you, both rows, we're going to take one here, one there, and alternate for the next half an hour before we conclude for questions and also any brief comments. And I would really appreciate if each one of you, and I recognize many of the distinguished guests here, to introduce him or herself. Please go ahead.
Nihal Fahmi, a member of the Egyptian Council for Foreign Affairs and a previous adjunct faculty at AUC as well, teaching political science and international organizations. I have one comment for you and a question. And my comment begins with your attempt to give an analysis or an explanation why this revolution has taken place, and in not in Egypt also, but everywhere else, and how models have failed to anticipate that this could happen. And in your analysis, you have used very big words, and I see it's much simpler than that. You have used big words like psychological mood of empowerment in the region and so on and so forth. But I think you have really overlooked a very important factor. This did not begin with an aim to overthrow the president or the regime. It gradually built up. And one of the factors that actually made this happen is the reaction of the regime itself. Without this arrogant, delayed response of the regime, it wouldn't have yielded such results in all countries. So I think you are overlooking this very important factor. It did not start with a purpose, with this very clear aim. This is just my comment. And my question is that you have been attempting to see the different narratives of the situation and the different groups that contributed to this revolution, including the groups that we, all Egyptians, were worried about to be there in Tahrir, the Muslim Brothers and whoever else, other categories. And you stated very clearly that such narratives will precede the, how the American foreign policy will shape up, all right? So in your analysis as well of your own narrative, I am very much surprised that you did not mention Israel. You did not mention that the American foreign policy will eventually be affected, impacted by how Israel sees this kind of revolution. We see Netanyahu now speaking that the changes going on in the Arab world might not be in the interest of Israel at the end, and he is very much worried how these revolutions in all the countries coming up will end. So,
do we allow Mr. Telhami to answer some of that?
So this is the question: how come you did not mention Israel in this? Okay.
Actually, I did in a big way. I said the only two questions on mind of Congress is how is this going to impact Israeli-U.S. relations and the Muslim Brotherhood. So I said that. Those are the questions that are in Washington. Not only that, the only piece I did for the New York Times on the Egyptian crisis was arguing that this has a huge impact in Israel, and that Israel isn't going to worry about how the narrative is going to be written, and that their focus is not going to be the peace process, it's going to be how to make sure that the relationship between the U.S. and Israel is defined in a way that is supportive of Israel. So, you know, I think you misinterpret. I was just talking about what the events are going to be here. When I said the war of narratives, and many parties are interested, obviously Israel isn't one of them, and it's the only one I actually highlighted in the New York Times. I mean, it was all about the Israeli calculations of what it is. So it was, maybe accidental, but I mentioned Israel because I wasn't really talking about these factors. Now, on the regime response, I'm not sure what you really mean, because I think when you look at the regime, we've had the three big cases we have different regime responses. We had in Tunisia a rapid, fleeing of the president. To this day, it's not clear, why he left so quickly, and whether or not he actually assumed he's coming back. Because a lot of people, think that it's a theory. There are multiple theories about it. That matters in the individual case. We had a case in Egypt where we had a different presidential reaction, where there was initially a denial. There was certainly not an attempt to the lesson learned from Tunisia: don't leave too quickly. And then there was an attempt by some groups to attack the demonstrators in a way we should forget. It was bloody in terms of how many Egyptians were actually killed and wounded. Peaceful, the demonstrators were peaceful, but there was an attempt to crush it that backfired. And then we had the Libyan model, which is unbelievably horrible on a scale that was hardly imaginable, even by people who knew Gaddafi and what he's capable of. And it's going to fail. That's the attempt by a regime, I think, is going to fail. So what I'm suggesting to you is that, yeah, regime response matters, no question. And it is conceivable that the Mubarak regime could have said from day one, I mean, there were always two steps too late at least. Maybe the second speech he could have given as the first speech, and may have stopped but it would have created change. So when we say about public empowerment, meaning the public wants to be heard, it's not in every case wanting to change the government. It's that they want to be heard. They don't want to be taken for granted. And that's going to be a factor in every conceivable government. So we can't predict the exact outcome. And some of those attempts are going to fail to change governments, even when they really want to change government. In Bahrain, you're having a completely different coalition. Now, to be honest, while I'm looking at a macro level at a regional trend, every country is different. Not in the terms that I've described. I think the terms I've described really are broad, and I think they apply pretty much the gap that we've seen between publics and governments is in every place. But recall that in many places we have divided societies. And when you have divided societies where the fear of the other side in that division is so paramount, that there are completely different calculations. We see that up to a point in Bahrain, we see it more in Yemen, and those are going to play themselves very differently. But it's still the case.